So we were supposed to see that how this machine learning idea or the history or the inception of machine learning. So the machine learning came with the idea of the inception of artificial neurons, which is from which has is a resemblance similar to the biological neuron. So what is this neuron? So neurons are the subunit of our biological brain that can or that is the core what do we say the core unit of our biological brain, which can send and receive the information so it is the main functional unit of our nervous system. It can send and receive messages in form of electrical currents, which is called as nerve impulses. So the core signaling system of our brain, it depends on this functioning of neuron. It's a subunit of our biological brain. So based on that ideology, there was this artificial neurons which came into existence. So the figure shows a schematic view of biological neurons. So this biological neurons can be understood as a subunits of neural network in a biological brain. Here the signals of the variable magnitude or different magnitude arrive at the dendrite. Those signals are then accumulated in the cell body of the neuron, and if the accumulated signal exceeds certain threshold, then the output signal is generated that will be passed further by the axons. So you have this input signals of different magnitude or different amplitude arriving at the dendrites. Then those signals are then accumulated in the cell body of this neuron, which is the subunit or the main functional unit. And if the accumulated signal in this functional unit exceeds some certain threshold, then the output signal is generated, which is then passed to the axons. The fundamental unit of a neural network, similarly the fundamental unit of a neural network, so we were talking about our biological brain which had biological neurons. Similarly, on the same idea or same concept, the neural network is also designed, in which there is artificial neuron which takes an input, processes it, and passed it through an activation function that returns the activated output. So we have to see and understand that what is this activation function. So this activation functions are really important for the neural network to learn and make sense of something really complicated, and to understand the non-linear complex functional mapping between the input and the response variable. So this activation function tries to learn and makes sense and does the mapping between the input and the response variable. These activation functions introduce nonlinear properties to the network, right? So the machine learning, it all evolved and began with the ideology of our biological brain and functioning of the neurons in our brain. In the similar concept came was this neural network in which there is artificial neurons. Now we have tried to understand that what is this artificial neuron, but now let us see the formal definition of an artificial neuron. So artificial neurons which receive input change their internal state, that is activation, according to that input and produces output depending on the input and the activation. So an activation function G is an alternative form of simple unit step function. So in the, if you see the figure on the extreme left, there is a unit step function which is also called as Heaviside step function. So the unit step function is a discontinuous function whose value is 0 for negative argument and 1 for the positive argument. So it tries to differentiate the signal based on the linear combination of input values x and the weight w, and based on this input and the activation function, the output is produced, which is depending on the input and the activation function. So if the linear combination of input value x and weight w is less than 0, then if it is the negative argument, then the value is 0, and if it is a positive argument, then this value is 1. So g of z is an activation function that takes this linear combination of input value x and weight w as z equal to w1 into x1 plus w2 into x2 and so on till wn m xm, and if this gz is greater than certain defined threshold, then we predict that particular class as 1, or we predict that particular as 1 or 0, or also 1 or minus 1. So when we say 1 or 0, it is piecewise linear function. So you can see that the component of the neural network relies on the activation function and the input, and then there is this linear combination of input value x and the weight, and accordingly it produces the output. So the second diagram, it shows that if this input linear combination, which is based on input value and weight, if it is less than 0, then it forms negative argument, and for positive argument it is 1. So this activation function, which is a linear combination of input value x, is a m-dimensional sample from the training data set, and w is the feature or feature vector. So we said that the machine learning came into picture with the idea of artificial neurons, that is been borrowed from the idea of how our brain works. Based on that, the first machine learning algorithm that was developed is perceptron. So this is very simple but very powerful algorithm. So now what makes this algorithm very powerful is that this algorithm automatically learns the optimal weight coefficients that are then multiplied with the input feature in order to make the decision whether a neuron fires or not. So let us, before understanding the working of this perceptron algorithm, let us first understand what is a perceptron. So a perceptron is a computer model or a computerized machine devised to represent or stimulate the ability of brain to recognize and discriminate. So our brain is capable to recognize or discriminate things. So similar, based on how our brain functions, we simulate a computer model that can get the ability to recognize or discriminate. So that is the meaning of perceptron. That is, it's a computer model or a computer machine that is devised to represent or stimulate the ability to recognize and discriminate, the way, in the similar fashion how our brain does it. So a perceptron, it receives multiple input signals, and if the sum of the input signal exceed a certain threshold, it either returns a signal or remains silent. So this artificial neurons and perceptrons were inspired by the biological process of the brain. The perceptron, it belongs to the category of supervised learning algorithm, that is a single layer binary linear classifier useful to determine if a sample belongs to one class or another. So if you see the figure, there is this feature vector, that is weight, and the input features. So this algorithm, it tries to learn the optimal weight coefficient which is multiplied with the input feature to make a decision whether a neuron is fire or not. So this is taken as an input function, and this input along with the activation function gives an output, and this weight coefficients are updated at each iteration. It gets updated, the error is updated, it learns, and then in that way it optimizes or tries to find the optimal weight coefficients. The commonly used activation functions for neural network are unit step, linear, logistic, hyperbolic, tangent. So now this all activation function introduce non-linear property to our network, and whose corresponding function is given. So for unit step, it discriminates the negative argument and positive argument and assigns the value as 1 0 or 1 minus 1. For linear, you have the activation function gz equal to z. For logistic, you have the equation, and for hyperbolic tangent you have the equation is exponential of 2 to z minus 1 divided by exponential of 2 into z plus 1. So this activation function tries to understand the nonlinear complex mapping between the input and the response variable. So there are different activation functions for artificial neuron. Now, what makes this perceptron and machine learning algorithm is this perceptron learning rule. So a notable American psychologist, that is Frank Rosenwald, he brought this idea of perceptron learning rule, that made this a machine learning algorithm. The rule is about learning the weights for the input signals in order to draw linear decision boundary that allows to discriminate between two linearly separable classes, that is plus 1 or minus 1. So with this perceptron learning rule, the algorithm learns the weight for the input signal so that it can try to draw a linear decision boundary. So when I say linear decision boundary, it means that you can draw a line that separates the two classes. You can draw a line that can, by which on the one side you can say that all points on one side belongs to one particular class, and on all points on the other side of that line belongs to one class. So that makes it linearly separable. So introduction of this perceptron learning rule made this idea of perceptron model as a machine learning algorithm. But convergence is one of the biggest problem of perceptron. So it is proved mathematically that the perceptron learning rule converges if the two classes can be separated by a linear hyperplane. So if you see the extreme left figure, you can separate the two classes by a linear hyperplane. So in that case, the learning rule, perceptron learning rule, will converge. But if you see the extreme two right side figures, you cannot separate these two classes by a linear hyperplane, as these are non-linear, that is not linear, these are not linearly separable. So here, in those cases, the algorithm will not converge, and the weights will never stop updating unless we set some maximum number of iteration or maximum number of epochs. So convergence is one of the biggest problem of this perceptron algorithm. So with this we saw the theory and the idea behind this perceptron algorithm. In the next part of the video, we will see how to build this perceptron machine learning algorithm from scratch.